The Pacific sky is clear, almost deceptively calm. Mid-morning light glints off the ocean far below, broken only by the thin white wakes of ships moving in tight formation. Somewhere above them, engines growl and propellers carve invisible spirals into the air. A Japanese pilot tightens his turn. He has done this before. Many times. The enemy aircraft ahead of him is larger, heavier, an American fighter. Experience tells him the outcome is already decided. Western planes do not turn like a Zero. They never have. He pulls harder on the stick, committing to the circle. The world tilts. Blue sky becomes sea. The Zero responds instantly, light and eager, just as its designers promised. For a brief moment, confidence returns. But the American fighter does not fall away. Instead, it stays with him. The distance between the two aircraft does not grow. It shrinks. The Japanese pilot blinks, adjusts, and tightens the turn, further pushing his aircraft closer to its limits. Still, the enemy remains locked in place. Steady, controlled, refusing to bleed speed or position. Something is wrong. And in that realization, high above the Pacific, a balance of air, combat is already beginning to change. By the time the Pacific War began, and a ruthless emphasis on individual flying skill, in the skies over China in the late 1930s, Japanese fighter pilots had already tested their aircraft against foreign-designed sand, usually emerged victorious. At the center of this confidence was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. Light, agile, and astonishingly maneuverable, it represented a clear design philosophy. Range and turn performance mattered more than protection. Armor was sacrificed. Self-sealing fuel tanks were omitted. Weight was stripped wherever possible. What remained was an aircraft that could outturn almost anything in the sky. Japanese naval doctrine reinforced this advantage. Only a small percentage of candidates survived the full course. Those who did emerged with hundreds of flight hours, far more than their Western counterparts, an intimate understanding of close-in dogfighting. When war erupted across the Pacific, the results seemed to validate everything Japan believed about air combat. At Pearl Harbor, American aircraft were destroyed on the ground or cut down as they scrambled into the air. In the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, Allied fighters struggled to cope with the Zero's turning ability. Pilots flying P-40s, Buffaloes, and early naval fighters found themselves consistently outmaneuvered in horizontal combat. Western aircraft were heavier, less responsive. This belief hardened through early victories at Coral Sea and the opening stages of the Pacific Campaign. Even when losses occurred, they were often attributed to numbers or surprise, not technical inferiority. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 did not just cost Japan for carriers. Unlike the United States, Japan had no large-scale system to rapidly train and replace veteran airmen. Each downed pilot represented years of investment that could not be easily replaced. At the same time, American forces were learning, often painfully, how not to fight the Zero. Pilots who survived early encounters began sharing hard-earned lessons. Turning with a Zero was a mistake. More guns meant slower turns. These assumptions had been correct so far. What Japanese intelligence did not fully grasp was that the United States Navy was not merely improving existing aircraft, it was designing a new one from the ground up, shaped directly by the lessons of defeat. Not a lightweight duelist, but a controlled, powerful predator meant to survive, absorb damage, and still fight effectively. Another opponent that should lose the turn. That expectation would follow them into combat right up until the moment it failed. The U.S. Navy understood that its frontline carrier, fighter, the F6F Wildcat, was outmatched in pure maneuverability by the Zero. And most of all, pilots needed an aircraft that forgave mistakes instead of punishing them with death. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation absorbed these lessons with characteristic The company had a reputation inside the Navy for rugged designs aircraft built to come home. At first glance, it seemed to confirm Japanese expectations. The Hellcat was larger and heavier than the Zero. Its broad wings and thick fuselage gave it a stocky appearance, more industrial than graceful. It carried armor plating to protect the pilot. Its fuel tanks were These were features the Zero had deliberately sacrificed. But hidden beneath that weight was something the Zero could not match. Raw power. The Hellcat was built around the Pratt & Whitney A280 double WASP engine, one of the most powerful radial engines of the war, with more than 2,000 horsepower available. The Hellcat had acceleration and climb performance that changed the dynamics of a fight. Speed could be gained quickly. Energy could be recovered, and mistakes could be corrected. Equally important was how the aircraft handled at the edge of its performance envelope. Grumman engineers paid close attention to low-speed behavior, stall characteristics, and control response under stress. The Hellcat was designed to remain predictable, even when pushed hard, especially during carrier landings, but also in combat. This mattered more than many pilots realized at first, as Hellcats began entering service in mid-1943. The U.S. Navy was also transforming how it trained its airmen. Unlike Japan's elite, small-batch pilot system, the American approach emphasized volume, standardization, and survival. Pilots were taught not just how to fly, but how to fight as a unit. Tactics were drilled repeatedly. Emergency procedures were second nature. By the time a Hellcat pilot reached the fleet, he might not have had the thousands of hours logged by a Japanese veteran, but he knew exactly how to use his aircraft's strengths, and just as importantly, how to avoid its weaknesses. Doctrine evolved alongside hardware. U.S. Navy pilots were instructed to avoid prolonged turning contests when possible. They were taught to exploit speed, altitude, and coordinated attacks. But combat was rarely neat. Engagements collapsed into chaos. Fighters lost altitude, formations broke, and pilots found themselves forced into close-range maneuvering whether they wanted to or not. This was where the Hellcat revealed its quiet advantage. Contrary to Japanese assumptions, the aircraft did not behave like earlier American fighters. It did not wallow or bleed speed uncontrollably when maneuvering. With proper use of flaps and throttle, the Hellcat could maintain tight, sustained turns, especially at medium speeds where the Zero began to lose its edge. Japanese pilots, encountering the Hellcat for the first time, often misjudged it. They saw its size and assumed inferiority in maneuverability. They committed to the turn, confident that experience and aircraft design would carry the day. But the battlefield was no longer the same as it had been in 1941. The Zero's advantages were real, but fragile. Its lack of armor meant even brief exposure to heavy machine gun fire could be fatal. Its structural limits punished aggressive dives and high-speed maneuvers. And its pilots, once irreplaceable masters, were now fewer, more fatigued, and increasingly outnumbered. The stage was set for confrontation not just between two aircraft, but between two philosophies of air combat, one rooted in pre-war ideals of individual mastery, the other built on adaptation, resilience, and relentless production. When these philosophies collided in the sky, the outcome would not be decided by reputation, but by what actually happened when pilots pulled back on the stick and waited to see who fell away first. By the time the Hellcat entered widespread combat, the men flying against it were not the same pilots who had swept the skies in 19. Many of Japan's most experienced naval aviators were already gone lost over Midway, Guadalcanal, and the long attritional battles that followed. Those who remained carried immense experience, but also mounting exhaustion. Japanese naval aviation had been built around a core belief: quality over quantity. Pilots were trained for years, refined through constant evaluation, and expected to fight with individual initiative. In the early war, this produced elite airmen capable of extraordinary feats. But the system had a fatal weakness. It could not replace losses at scale. As casualties mounted, training programs were shortened. New pilots arrived at the front, with far fewer hours and less combat exposure. They were competent, but not exceptional. Veteran pilots found themselves leading formations filled with men who could not maneuver, coordinate, or survive at the same level. Across the ocean, the American system moved in the opposite direction. Hellcat pilots often arrived in combat with less individual flying time than Japanese veterans, but they arrived in large numbers, consistently trained and supported by doctrine that emphasized survival and teamwork. They were told explicitly that retreat was acceptable, that breaking off a fight was not cowardice, and that living to fly again mattered more than personal glory. This psychological difference mattered in the turn. A Japanese pilot entering a maneuvering fight often committed fully, pushing his aircraft closer to its limits in pursuit of a decisive advantage. An American pilot, by contrast, was trained to assess, adjust, and disengage if necessary. When a Hellcat stayed in the turn longer than expected, it created hesitation and emotional fracture in a split-second decision cycle. Early in the war, Japanese pilots had thrived in one-on-one or small group engagements. Turning duels rewarded their training in aircraft design, but by 1943, U.S. Navy tactics had evolved into something far less accommodating. Hellcats rarely fought. Alone, they flew in mutually supporting pairs and divisions, maintaining spacing and communication. Maneuvers like the thatch we've developed earlier with Wildcats were refined and adapted for the Hellcat's greater power and speed. The goal was not to outturn the enemy, but to force him into a vulnerable position through coordinated movement. Yet combat rarely unfolded according to doctrine. Engagements often collapsed into close-ranged fights, as aircraft lost altitude, visibility deteriorated, and formations fractured. In these moments, Japanese pilots expected the advantage to return to them. The Zero's legendary maneuverability was supposed to dominate once the fight slowed and tightened. What surprised them was that the Hellcat did not immediately lose control of the engagement. With combat flaps deployed and power available on demand, Hellcat pilots could maintain tighter turns than Japanese pilots anticipated, especially when the Zero was already carrying battle damage, low fuel, or a fatigued airframe. The Hellcat's predictability allowed pilots to push the aircraft harder without fear of sudden stall or structural failure. This did not mean the Hellcat was superior in every turning scenario. It was not, but it meant the Zero no longer held uncontested dominance. In tactical terms, this narrowed the margin for Japanese pilots. A maneuver that once guaranteed positional advantage now required perfect execution. Any miscalculation, any overcommitment, could be punished by heavy machine gun fire, delivered from a platform that could absorb hits and keep flying. And when that happened, the turning fight ceased to be a contest of it became a test of endurance and survivability. By the time Japanese pilots realized they were no longer dictating the terms of engagement, the fight had already shifted beneath them. The sky no longer. Japanese intelligence assessments lagged behind reality. Reports from early encounters with the Hellcat were filtered through expectations, shaped by years of fighting Wildcats and land-based Army aircraft. Size equaled weight equaled inferiority. These assumptions were reinforced by doctrine. Japanese pilots were trained to exploit turning combat because it had worked so consistently. Adjusting that mindset required not just new information, but the willingness to abandon a winning formula. That shift came slowly. By the time many pilots realized the Hellcat's true capabilities, they were encountering it not in isolated skirmishes, but in massed formations protecting carrier task forces. A misjudged turn no longer meant embarrassment. It meant exposure to concentrated fire from multiple aircraft. The Zero, once feared for its agility, now revealed its vulnerabilities under these conditions. Lacking armor, it could not absorb even brief bursts. Lacking power, it struggled to recover energy once lost, and lacking experienced pilots in sufficient numbers, it could not adapt as quickly. As its opponent, perhaps the most decisive angle was not mechanical, but mental. For a Japanese pilot, the turning fight was not just a tactic, it was identity. It was proof of mastery. When a Hellcat refused to yield in the circle, it created a moment of cognitive dissonance. The rules were being violated. The expected outcome did not arrive, and air combat hesitation is lethal. A pilot who questions his assumptions loses tempo. A fraction of a second spent reassessing becomes an opening. Hellcat pilots, trained to exploit exactly these moments, pressed the advantage. They tightened fire discipline. They held position. They waited. The Zero pilot, meanwhile, was often forced to choose between continuing a fight that was no longer guaranteed, or disengaging in an aircraft poorly suited to escape under fire. Either option carried risk. This psychological shift rippled outward. Pilots shared stories. Confidence eroded. The Zero was no longer automatically dominant. Every engagement carried uncertainty. And uncertainty, multiplied across squadrons and campaigns, changed behavior. The turning fight, once the Zero's sanctuary, became a trap if entered carelessly. And as more pilots learned this lesson the hard way, the balance of air combat tipped further, setting the stage for the moment when theory collapsed completely into brutal, irreversible reality. That moment would come not as a single duel, but as a pattern repeated across battles, carriers, and skies until the outcome was no longer in doubt. By late 1943, the pattern was no longer isolated. It repeated itself across the Central Pacific over island chains. Above carrier task forces and along the approach routes, Japanese pilots were ordered to defend at all costs. The Hellcat was no longer new. It was now the dominant presence in U.S. Navy fighter squadrons, and its pilots were increasingly experienced. Engagements often began the same way: radar contact, scramble orders, fighters climbing hard from carrier decks, engines at full power, propellers biting into humid air. Japanese formations approached with purpose, still believing that close combat offered their best chance. The Zero's agility remained their most trusted tool. The first passes were fast. Diving attacks, gunfire flashing briefly before aircraft scattered. Altitude bled away as pilots tightened turns, searching for advantage. This was where Japanese pilots expected the fight to swing in their favor once speed dropped. Once the engagement became intimate, a Zero would commit to the circle, its wings cutting a tight arc through the sky. The Hellcat followed. At first, the Japanese pilot waited for the familiar signs. The American fighter should widen its turn. It should lose lift. It should begin to slide outward, exposing its belly or tail. Instead, it stayed locked in place. The Hellcat's engine roared steadily, power feeding back into the turn. Its pilot adjusted flaps in measured increments, careful not to bleed too much speed, confident the aircraft would respond. The controls remained firm, predictable. No sudden stall, no violent shudder. Seconds stretched. The Zero pilot pushed harder. Control forces increased. The aircraft began to tremble at the edge of its envelope. Without armor or structural reinforcement, the margin for error was thin. Pull too hard, and the wings risked failure. Ease off in position would be lost. The Hellcat pilot did neither. He held. This was the moment when experience collided with reality. Japanese pilots had trained 4 years to dominate this exact situation. It was spending energy without reward. Around them, the sky was no longer empty. Other Hellcats entered the fight, maintaining altitude, choosing angles. The turning contests below fixed the Zero's path. As the months progressed, the consequences of these encounters became impossible to ignore. What had begun as isolated surprises hardened into a consistent pattern across the Central Pacific. The Hellcat was no longer merely holding its own. It was dictating the terms of engagement. Japanese pilots adapted where they could. Some avoided turning fights altogether, attempting quick slashing attacks from altitude. Others sought to lure American fighters into vertical maneuvers, hoping to exploit the Zero's lighter weight. But these adjustments came too late, and too unevenly. The operational environment had shifted faster than doctrine could follow. By 1944, Hellcat squadrons were flying daily combat air patrols over U.S. carrier task forces. Their presence was constant, layered, and disciplined. Japanese formations arrived already under pressure, forced to react instead of initiate. When combat closed, the turning fight still emerged, but now it unfolded under American control. Hellcat pilots had learned precisely how far they could push their aircraft. They knew when to tighten the turn and when to trade maneuvering space for energy. They understood that the Hellcat did not need to win instantly. It only needed to survive long enough for help to arrive. The Zero's vulnerabilities grew more pronounced with every engagement. Without self-sealing tanks, even minor hits could be catastrophic. Without engine power reserves, recovery from mistakes became increasingly difficult. Losses mounted. Japanese after-action reports began to reflect a grim reality. Encounters that once favored the Zero now resulted in disproportionate casualties. Pilots reported American fighters that refused to disengage, that absorbed punishment, and that remained controllable deep into maneuvering combat. The psychological impact compounded the physical losses. Confidence, once absolute, eroded rapidly. Pilots who doubted their advantage hesitated. Hesitation widened gaps. Gaps were exploited. In the air war, numbers mattered, but so did momentum. As experienced Japanese pilots were lost, replacements arrived with less training and fewer hours. They faced Hellcat pilots who, by contrast, were accumulating combat experience at an accelerating rate. Each engagement widened the gap further. Skill disparity replaced design disparity. By mid-1944, the results were unmistakable. The F6F Hellcat achieved kill ratios that reflected not just aircraft superiority, but systemic dominance. Japanese carrier aviation, already weakened, could not recover. Entire formations were shattered before reaching their targets. History often remembers. There was no single duel that symbolized the change. Instead, it unfolded through repetition, through the steady grinding down of an opponent who could no longer rely on familiar advantages. Hellcat pilots did not need to outturn the Zero every time. They only needed to deny its certainty. Once that certainty vanished, every engagement became a risk Japan could not afford. By the time the decisive carrier battles of 1944 unfolded, the outcome was already written in the air. Japanese pilots entered combat knowing they were outmatched not just in numbers, but in resilience, coordination, and survivability. The sky that once belonged to the Zero now belonged to an aircraft built not on elegance, but on endurance. And when the battles ended, the silence that followed told its own story of empty decks, missing pilots, and a doctrine that could no longer function under the realities of modern industrial war. Those realities would define what came next. When the fighting eased and the carrier decks settled back into routine, the numbers began to tell the story that individual encounters already had. They were not the result of a single battle, but of an entire campaign measured in losses, replacements, and shrinking margins. The F6F Hellcat emerged as the most dominant carrier fighter of the Pacific War. By the end of its service, it would account for the majority of U.S. Navy aerial victories. Against Japanese aircraft, particularly the Zero-to-kill ratios, reflected more than tactical success. They reflected collapse. Japanese naval aviation suffered losses it could no longer absorb. As the war progressed into 1944 and beyond, the imbalance created by the Hellcat's dominance became structural. It was no longer a question of whether Japanese naval aviation could recover, but how long it could continue to function at all. Efforts were made to adapt. New aircraft designs were rushed forward. Training syllabi were revised. Tactical instructions warned pilots to avoid turning contests with American fighters whenever possible. But these changes existed mostly on paper. In the air, reality moved faster than reform. The Zero's limitations could not be corrected without abandoning the very qualities that had once defined it. Adding armor increased weight, strengthening the structure reduced agility. Improving survivability required compromises. Japanese wartime industry struggled to make underbombing, material shortages, and shrinking production capacity. Meanwhile, the Hellcat continued to improve not in radical leaps, but in reliability. Maintenance crews refined procedures. Pilots gained confidence in what their aircraft could endure. Every mission reinforced institutional knowledge that was shared, standardized, and replicated across squadrons. By the time of the major carrier engagements of 1944, Japanese air groups faced an almost impossible task. Hellcats intercepted attackers far from their targets. Engagements occurred at altitudes and speeds chosen by the Americans. When combat tightened into turning fights, Japanese pilots could no longer assume advantage. The psychological burden on Japanese airmen grew heavier with each sortie. Knowing that an opponent could match you where you once dominated changed how risks were calculated. Aggression gave way to caution. Caution reduced effectiveness. Reduced effectiveness increased losses. In some cases, pilots were ordered into missions with little expectation of survival. The shift toward desperate measures reflected not ideology alone, but the recognition that conventional air superiority was no longer achievable. For American pilots, the experience was different. The Hellcat inspired trust. Pilots believed they could take hits and still return. They believed their wingmen would be there. They believed the system behind them would replace losses and rotate exhausted units. This confidence translated directly into performance. By the end of the war, the Hellcat's record stood as one of the most lopsided in aerial combat history. But the numbers alone obscured the deeper lesson. The Hellcat did not win because it was the best turning fighter. It won because it functioned reliably within a larger framework that rewarded adaptability over tradition. Japanese naval aviation entered the war with unmatched skill and an aircraft perfectly suited to its doctrine. It exited shattered not because that skill vanished, but because the environment no longer rewarded it. The turning fight had once been a test of mastery. By 1944, it had become a relic, dangerous, outdated, and increasingly fatal to those who relied on it. The Hellcat did not erase the Zero's legacy. It redefined it. What remained was not the myth of invincibility, but a hard-earned understanding of how air warfare had evolved, away from individual brilliance and toward systems that could sustain pressure over time. That understanding would echo far beyond the Pacific, shaping how future wars would be fought in the air. The story of the Zero and the Hellcat is often told as a simple contest between two machines, one light and elegant, the other heavy and powerful. But that framing misses what truly changed in the skies over the Pacific. The Zero was not defeated because it suddenly became a bad aircraft. In the early war, it was perfectly matched to the world it fought in, a world where individual skill, extreme maneuverability, and close-range combat decided outcomes. In that environment, the Hellcat belonged to a different world. It was built for a war of endurance, for sustained operations, for pilots who would make mistakes and live through them. Its strength was not brilliance in a single maneuver, but reliability across thousands of sorties. It did not need to win every turning fight. It only needed to deny certainty and then let numbers, coordination, and survivability do the rest. What Japanese pilots encountered when the Hellcat stayed with them in the turn was not just an unexpected capability, it was the collapse of a familiar logic. The assumptions that had guided training